Okay. So, okay, so you were picking up where just after your mother passed away, I guess, and so things were changed. So you lived with Lydia and your father.
My father, yeah. Well, but Lydia came on the scene. It was a year and a half to 2 years after. I can't remember the date. But in 1937, I'm sure it was 37, Roz and Joe got married. That was at the Standish Hall Hotel over in Hull.
Yeah.
That was a nice wedding, and Mr. and Mrs. Barrett were there. They were still alive and all that, the whole family. And but in the meantime, everybody cleared out, and I was left alone with my stepmother and dad. And what was I then? I was
11 or something.
not
9.
quite. No. Then we're now. I again. Those were the years. Like the two salient things that happened personally and globally was my mother's death, which was a family matter, but it changed everything. And the other thing was the prelude to the Second Great War and my father's total preoccupation with getting the rest of his family out of Europe. And when I say preoccupation, I can still visualize him coming home from work. He used to take the streetcar home. We never owned a car, and I was standing at the window of our house on Clemo Avenue, looking in the park, and he would be walking down. And I remember distinctly because his head was always down. He was depressed, and he was always looking down. And he was totally involved with trying to get Uncle Leopold and Eliyahu and Itzhak and Vera out of there, and they wouldn't come. But
His,
in the meantime,
brothers.
His brother Leopold,
right,
and their family and his wife. They wouldn't come. They weren't to come. They eventually got to Israel. But in the meantime, the Goldsteins, one by one and so on, were all coming over. And this was a long period because I think I had mentioned this before. Uncle Leopold had a very good job. He was the only one who was. So there was reluctance to leave. But unfortunately, the ones that were in Budapest and Bratislava, Vilmos and Zsófi, Vilmos' younger brother, and that's Shimi and Mendy and Mathilde's father and mother, were there, and he couldn't get them out. Because I know he was in touch with the International Red Cross very intimately.
Mm-hmm.
They were involved in trying to get, save some Jews. I don't know how much they tried, but I know that was part of it, and with what other Jewish agencies there were trying to make contact and trying to make things happen.
Mm-hmm.
The upshot was, unfortunately, they didn't make it. They were taken and they perished in Auschwitz, and that just very terribly difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And I have this from two sources, my dad and from my still, thank God, living first cousin Eliyahu, the youngest of Uncle Leopold's children, who now resides in Israel, and we're in close touch all the time. Every month we talk to one another, and have done for years and years. He and I are only 2 months apart in age. In any event, my dad was really devastated by losing touch with. They didn't find out till much later what really happened, but of course they assumed that they were taken in the Holocaust. And in the meantime, the Goldstein family settled here. They all came to us over time, one by one, but thank God, the two that resisted were his dear sister, Auntie Bella. She was the next sibling of his, and she was the mother of all the 8 Goldsteins. All of them were here except Henoch.
He brought them over, or they were here?
No, he brought them over. Every one of them over. Every one of them. And except Henoch and Auntie Bella, they would not leave. And My dad, I can remember getting panicky about it. And finally, he threw up his hands. He said, I don't know what else to do. I don't know what there else is to do.
He was sponsoring them, or what he actually...
Yeah, sponsoring them. Oh, yeah, for sure. Every one of them. Getting them, getting them into school and all this.
But to get them over, he had to... he had connections with politicians?
Yes. He was... You know, the hat shop was a block away from Parliament Hill, and we had cabinet ministers and so on who were customers, and he knew them, not intimate or anything, because being Jewish was... But he did have influence, and he used whatever he could to make connections and so on.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting.
Anyway, finally, Cousin Henoch and Auntie Bella realized, and it was almost too late, 39, okay, because they got here in August of 1939, and the war began on the 1st of September. 1st of September. So it was that close. Anyway, thank God they got here. He got them a house on Nepean Street, a half a block away from the Bank Street store, and Auntie Bella and Sam. He helped them with a house. By this time, Sam had been here for some years, and Harry, and they had the Goldstein Brothers Electrical and so on. They were making livings and so on. So it was a combined effort all around. But without question, he was the driving force to
and Mendy and Shimmy and...
Well, unfortunately, their parents perished.
So it was after the war. After the war, he brought them over.
Yes. So they were... I've talked it over with Shimmy, and you were with me, I think, when we were talking over, but I thought they were in concentration camps. They weren't. They were in labor camps, and they spent a good part of the war there. And Mathilde too, and it was after the war when they came over. So thank God they made it. Anyway, all of that was a depressing time for my dad, and of course he had the war came, and he was just overcome by the fact, and we knew much more directly about what was happening in the camps and so on, and the policies of Hitler and whatnot, and he couldn't make Uncle Leopold realize it, and there were lots of Jews who were reluctant to leave. They were leaving home. So it was touch and go.
So what were you? You were in public school then, I guess.
Well, I was great. Yeah, 11. I was 11. I was in 41. I would have been just at the end of public school. And
so you were always good in math.
39, I was 11. Excuse me. That's when the war began.
Right.
Okay. I said 41 because that's the year my dad had his first heart attack. So he was told that he had to cut back on work and so on and so forth. And
how old was he then?
How old was he? He was born in 1886. So
when he was 41?
14, 55, 56 years.
Pretty young.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Was he heavy? He smoked?
He was like all the men in those days, he was a chain smoker and worse cigarettes and all the wrong things. But he survived that, and I think that was more like 1940, because in 41, that's when the second heart attack came, and he was told he had to stop work, and at that time, Elliot was going through Queen's University, and the other kids were working here and there, Noel and whatnot. And but I remember very vividly because he had to call up Elliot, who had a very good job with the Hudson's Bay Company in Winnipeg. He was in Winnipeg already, and he was just getting launched, and they were very encouraging and so on. He wasn't married yet or anything. My dad phoned him up and said, "You have to come home. You got to take over the store. You have to take it over." And by that time, brother-in-law Joe was already in the store with Uncle Ernie, my mother's brother. And Elliot came back because in those days, what Dad said, you did. That was exactly what it was. And in that regard, I should bring up in that way, what your dad said you did, because some years later, I remember him saying to me, because the Gilad's Leopold Gluck family, the Gilads now, were settled in Israel, and my dad decided, Manny, is going to be the representative of that family in Israel, and he said, you are going to agriculture school. And I mentioned this earlier, I guess. I don't want to be a farmer. So anyway, as it evolved, I did indeed go to agricultural school. I went to McDonald College at McGill University and got a degree there.
You had some interest in it at that point?
No, but it was a Bachelor of Science, okay, and my dad didn't understand this. He thought it was all about farming, and it would be perfect because I would go on a kibbutz and take over and all this. But I fooled him because I was more interested in science.
You did like the science?
Oh yeah. I was leaning that way, math and so on. And there, the major subjects were biochemistry and the other sciences, and well, I focused on that. And anyway, I never ever did get to Israel.
So you were a good student?
I was always a good student. I did terribly in high school, but high school was just a mishmash. My mother's death, the war, it was all wartime. And I wasn't, a lot of kids weren't motivated. There were almost no men teachers. They were all in uniform, and my brothers were in uniform. Elliot and Lee were overseas, so I was upside down. But no, anyway. When my dad had to retire, he and Lydia moved to Brockville, and they spent the rest of their lives there in Brockville.
Do you have a little more about high school? Did sports, friends?
Oh, I played quite a bit of basketball.
High school, high school.
A little bit of football, not much. Played hockey. I had friends. Yeah, I had good friends. It's ironic. 3 or 4 years ago, I got a phone call from a close buddy of mine when we were little kids. I used to play up at his place a block away from our house on Patterson Avenue. Donnie Reshore, and we got together. We went through all kinds of things, reinforcing each other's memories of all this.
Yes, what do you remember?
Oh, that was the first 7 years. That was the idyllic time.
Oh, the first one, yeah.
That was way back, and he found me out, funnily enough. I didn't even think he would be alive. And anyway, we got together several times, and we had a nice time.
So the Jews and the non-Jews got along in the public schools pretty well?
Oh, but there was endless anti-Semitism all the time. But no, there were lots of... I had no Jewish friends. In that area, there were very, very few. There were a couple of Jewish people, but I had no Jewish friends. All my buddies were non-Jews.
So what was the anti-Semitism? It was just sort of like...
No, there was one house I went to and knocked on the door, and I knew this family. They were Roman Catholic, as it happened. And I could hear inside, don't let the little Jew boy in here. But those kinds of things were happening. We heard this, and then it just reinforces the gloom that my poor dad had, losing his wife, and the whole business of the Holocaust starting and all this. And the anti-Semitism that was pervasive. It is today too, so whether you like it or not. But that was the climate, the emotional climate. My dad then got sick and there was a big thing. He and Lydia tried to convince me to come to Brockville with them and live with them. And I've been torn to pieces a little bit. Because I'd lost my mother, I'd lost all my siblings had gone somewhere else, and I didn't want total strangeness and so on. So anyway, it turned out my dad, Roz and Joe, took me in, so to speak, and he paid all the expenses for my all of my expenses for those years, all those years.
Mm-hmm. How many years was that?
All my high school, like 41. The war started in 39, 41, right through 46.
Wow.
46 was when I went away to college, to McDonald College in agriculture. And I must say, that was a turning point, too. I can't avoid some of the distasteful things that were going on, notwithstanding your closeness, and you were close to Roz and Joe. They were at war with each other all the time in the household. There was no two ways about it. And Sonia, too, lived with us for a while until Rosalind said she couldn't stay there anymore. And I was left. And it was a difficult climate. They fought incessantly. And yes, later on in life they reconciled. And I got, because just jumping way ahead, I was always very close to Rhoda. That was the first baby I ever knew in my whole life. And later in life, we got back together again, and I had a wonderful time with Rhoda during her last years. So anyway, I don't know whether to start trying to continue. The point about it is that my leaving for college ushered in, for me personally, what I still could have to consider the 3 or 4 most happy years of my life. Right? First of all, having a disrupted family life and so on in a tight Jewish community. Right. There was a bad taste, and it was always shamefulness and so on, so forth, and breaking up the family and all that. Suddenly I got into a milieu where I wasn't known at all. Nobody knew a thing about me, and everything was at face value, so I suddenly felt confident.
Liberated.
I only had to be myself, that's all. I didn't have to be a gluck kid who was a mess. And I had 3 just wonderful years. I made many, many friends, and I still have some of them. And that's 60 years ago.
So high school was really bad?
High school?
Yeah. I mean, is it a gluck kid who was a mess? I mean,
I had buddies. I had good buddies. Jackie Subkov, Mark Dover. I still have, Jack died some years ago, but Mark and others around. I had some good times.
Right.
But the other thing was, I can't avoid this. I had the earlier years, the growing up years, with all the gloom and my mother's loss and all that, and Roz and Joe and so on. I had a terrible complex. I was frightened of females, and I never dated. I never had a girl. I never took out a girl or had anything to do with girls at all. Everybody thought I was nutty or something. Until I got away from Ottawa and was at McDonald College. And that ushered in another era when I had confidence enough. And that was part of the happiness, too, of Mac. But Mac was a lovely place. It was a beautiful happenstance. And in retrospect, always used to say, thank God my father insisted that I go to agricultural school, even though as I said, I fooled him because I did biochemistry, which was led to my eventually getting into medicine. So.
You said your relationship with him developed around that, though, more, right? On an adult.
Well, my dad was, he had a lot of losses, all his kids, and he and Lydia was a foreigner, and she wasn't a socialite like my mother had been, and so on. And moving to Brockville, I know he found a few kibitzers down there. There was a small, tiny Jewish community. Right. And incidentally, the names of the people, the main people, the binders, he was very, very good friends with them, and a few of those kids I knew, and so on. And he made a life down there, and it was a very reserved life. They lived in a little bungalow, and it was on the St. Lawrence River. And I used to go down every month or two for a weekend or something like that. But basically, they were isolated. So I don't know how to continue now.
Let's just see if we're still working.
Oh, is it not recorded?
No, I don't think so. I just want to make sure.